Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
The IKS division is not satisfied discussing about Shushrita, Aryabhatta, Agastya and other venerated acharyas. The division actively strives to create an ecosystem that will inspire and give rise to many more Shushrutas and Aryabhattas. Let's find out more about it.
Namaste. Identity, stability, prosperity. These are the eternal concerns of every nation, every civilization. Today, as India stands on the cusp of a great time ahead, we are talking about the dawn of a new epoch. Prime Minister Modi ji has given us the vision of Viksit Bharat. He has spoken about making time our friend through Amrit Kal. It is only natural that these questions of our identity, what do we mean by coming together as a civilization, and what does the vision of Viksit Bharat entail, animate all of our minds. And when we think about this from a knowledge systems perspective, when we talk about Indian knowledge systems, it is only natural that we start looking at the knowledge systems from a civilizational lens and not just locate them in one dimension of either academia or public discourse. So today, let's try and understand Indian knowledge systems from a perspective of civilizational journey and how does knowledge systems link with how people tell themselves the story about their civilization. So there is a question ahead of us when we talk about Indian knowledge systems as a compact. We're using three phrases and there is, of course, there is substantial understanding and acceptance of this within the academic literature and also in public discourse. But it is also important to disambiguate this and offer ourselves a cohesive definition so that we can all look at Indian knowledge systems together. We can think of Indian knowledge systems at three levels. The relevance of Indian knowledge systems by means of an epistemic diversity in the conversation around global futures. We are told we are a globalized civilization now. Whatever happens in one part of the world affects all of us regardless of where we are. And so it is only natural that the decisions that are taken have to be informed by a diverse pool of knowledge traditions. And if you do not have this, there is a great danger of a unipolar, one-sided, one-size-fits-all policy governing the entire global structures. At a second level, we have to think about Indian knowledge systems as a project of national integration. India is a complex polity. We all understand the challenges that we have, both civilizational and territorial. And the narratives that we hear about the national integrity have to be populated and in fact are a function of how we consider and what we consider to be knowledge. So there is a role for knowledge systems to be informing the idea of nationhood. And at a third and most central level, it is about the well-being, whether it is the global civilization, whether it is the national sovereignty conversation, all of it is in pursuit of a good life for the multitude, for everyone. Now, what is the definition of a good life according to our own knowledge system? Does it give us meaning? We are talking about a rapid rise in mental health crisis across the world. We're talking about a planet with 10 billion people but still lonely. We're talking about crisis of immigration. We're hearing cases of xenophobia. Does it have to do anything with knowledge systems and how people perceive what is to be of value and what informs that? So if we start thinking about the questions of identity, stability and prosperity, linking it to knowledge systems and looking at across the three dimensions of global futures, national integrity, and individual well-being for collective welfare, we start looking at Indian knowledge systems in a more systematic way. And let's disambiguate this further. Let's unpack what this word or this phrase of Indian knowledge systems really involves. We are clubbing three different ideas together. There is the idea of Indian, so we'll have to understand what it means to be Indian. There is an idea of Indian knowledge. Knowledge is knowledge. What is the claim here when we say it's Indian knowledge? Is there a claim to exceptionalism? And we are talking about a system. What makes knowledge a system? Or is there a knowledge that is not systematic? So if you explore this further, you would understand, in fact, S. Radhakrishnan in his opening remarks, when he writes his commentaries on Principal Upanishads, he asks this question. He in fact begins with this question. When we talk about Indian history and Indian civilization, is there a claim to exceptionalism? Are we saying that we've discovered something that nobody else ever has? And he suggests a way out of this kind of questioning. He says that all cultures, all societies, all human settlements, once they reach a certain level of stability, either through processing of things available in nature and creating habitats, or by some level of political and economic institution building, once they reach a certain kind of stability, invariably look towards the larger questions of life. It is inborn, innate in us to wonder about the meaning of life, the meaning of our existence, our relationship with nature, our relationship with God. So the questions are universal. But does it make the Indian knowledge system generic and not specific? And he answers this question and he says no. While all cultures have this reflection, only few cultures have managed to develop a sophisticated thought and the ability to transmit that thought across multiple generations. In fact, if we were to define a civilization, it is this continuity, it is this transference of our values and what we consider to be of a worthy pursuit. That is what civilization really stands for, and the institutions that we build around that. So when he answers this question, he actually removes this binary of Indian knowledge claim versus an exceptionalist claim. In some ways, it is that there is knowledge that is specific to this territory that has come from this culture, but the applicability of that is universal. The concerns of Indian knowledge are universal. That is how we should look at it. So if we have to disambiguate this further, if we have to look at each word and how they come together, think about the word Indian. The natural imagination, the image that our minds conjure when we think about Indian is a geographical idea. And in fact, it's been most poetically described in our traditions. We talk about the Himalayas in the north and the Hindu Mahasagara in the south. We have the sea and the bay. And this beautiful land, which is ensconced within these natural geographical systems, which has a continuous living tradition for over at least 5 millennia. This is what we understand as Bharatavarsha. So you think about Indian, the idea of a sacred geography. It's not just any other geography. There is an element of sacralization to this. Most Indians, it's natural for us to revere this land because this has given us our identity, this has given us our meaning, this has given us our welfare. But it is not just sociological. There is also a philosophical and metaphysical basis to this. But it doesn't mean that it is only geographical. There is an element of culture that mixes with geography to give us the distinct flavor of what we understand and today call as Indian. This comes to us best in the work of a 9th century poet, Rajashekara. In his seminal work, Kavya Mimamsa, he gives us an idea of how to understand this notion of geocultural oneness. And he says that the prince of literature married the princess of poetry. The prince of literature married the princess of poetry, and together they went on a journey. They went on a ride. And as long as they could travel, as far as they traveled, that became one desha. This is a very, very poetic idea. It gives us the clue of what we mean by Indianness. What do we mean by India as a geocultural entity? Why is it that we trace our identity back to the rishis? What are these ideas that were spread through literature and poetry? What it means is that there is the geographical idea, there is the sense of sacred geography, but the geography mixes with certain ideas of life that make culture. Normally, we understand culture as a set of shared norms, customs, rituals, or practices. All of that is also learned through socialization by meeting each other. Humans also learn by mimicking. All of these are evolutionary mechanisms for cultural building. But the culture is also informed by fundamental truth claims about life. That is what Rajashekara is hinting at. This desha was formed not on the basis of one ethnicity, one color, one caste, one region. There was a commonness created because the oneness was first understood. And that oneness is the metaphysics that comes to us from the Indian tradition. So when we call something Indian, we are simultaneously referring to the unity, the oneness that holds everything together, and the diversity it spawns. So we can say that the Indian knowledge systems refers to a geocultural space, and the geocultural space could be within this territory. There might be other parts where our culture got exported and replicated some elements of this civilization. But fundamentally, there is a territoriality to it, and also an element of how people conduct their lives across the length and breadth of this great land through a set of common ideas. And this is the key to understanding the comfort that Indians naturally have with diversity. In fact, unity in diversity is something that all of us understand as a distinctive Indian trait. If we wonder about what holds this diverse land together, we'll get to this idea of Indianness, that there are certain fundamental philosophical constructs. We talk about this as a way of life, but this way of life is not just any other way of life. This way of life is populated by a deep truth about what is a good life, what is our relationship with ourselves, what is our relationship with nature, and what is our relationship with God or the Almighty, that as we call it. Okay. So in the Indian knowledge systems can be understood as this geocultural entity. If that is Indian, what is knowledge? And after all, knowledge is knowledge. Why should there be a specificity to knowledge? Gravity, for example, is not associated with a region. But what do we mean by Indian knowledge? It's important to explore that further. Knowledge comes to us in the history of civilizations through cultures that become sophisticated, civilizations which is basically the apex institutional creation to propagate certain cultural values. Every civilization has one or more cultures, but not all cultures become civilization. It's important to understand this because there might be certain cultures or subcultures that are prominent, that in fact even dominate for a certain period of time. But for it to be a civilization and for it to become a knowledge-centric civilization, there has to be institutionalization of this. Historically, the place where this knowledge comes to people and how people started giving their life a certain order was through religions across the world and definitely in India as well. But if we look at the Indian knowledge tradition, we have to understand this as a lived tradition. These are actual practices and methods of transmission that have been evolved in this land by people who are familiar with this topography. So if you look at Indian knowledge and if you look at this definition of Indian knowledge, we look at the hoary tradition of the Vedic corpus, the great literature, the great poetics that we have, the great knowledge systems, the great structure of knowledge, language, the idea of sciences. All of this is encapsulated in what we call the Vedic corpus. You then have historical advancements like the Buddhist tradition, extraordinary achievements in meditation, in social ethics, also in political and statecraft. All of that is part of the tradition. You think about the cosmology of Jaina, some of the richest imagination and richest truth-seeking, along with a lived tradition and practice. You call that a knowledge tradition. You look at the Sikh tradition, how it actually interfaces with the civilizational knowledge system. But along with these systems, you have the lived traditions. You have the folk and the tribal tradition. This is where if you were to look at knowledge spatially, you have the knowledge of the city, the Nagara, you have the knowledge of the village, the folk tradition, and you have the knowledge of the Janjatiyas or the population of the forest, people who dwell with nature. And that is the tribal knowledge traditions that we have. So this claim to Indian knowledge, when we talk about a geocultural identity, it is not a quest for hierarchy. It is not seeking to impose a certain claim. It is actually a cultural complex. It is a cultural composite memeplex that comes to us from all of these different traditions that have been born in this land, that have been propagated, that still even today inform the life choices that we make as Indians. It is in the folk and tribal traditions. It is in the spaces of Nagara and Grama and Vana that all of us come together. We have a common experience as Indians when we look at each other in these spaces and interface with each other. So Indian knowledge is a specific reference to the traditions of knowledge and systems of transmission that have come to us from this land, which have been given us a certain way of life. So Indian is a geocultural idea. Knowledge is a memeplex of all of these different lived traditions that are extant even today. But what is a system? Now, when does knowledge become a system? knowledge, as far as it is able to give us certain utility, is already performing the job of informing our life choices and guiding our life direction in a productive manner. But a knowledge becomes a knowledge system when it meets certain criteria. We probably don't have an exhaustive definition of this, but we can attempt to create some taxonomy, some kind of rubric to help us think about knowledge traditions as a knowledge system. So when we talk about a knowledge system, there at least have to be four characteristics to it. You can probably have more, and it would be a great movement for all of us to reflect on this and think about what makes knowledge a system, what makes knowledge a tradition, how do we understand this in a lived way. But let's begin with these four characteristics. In research language, in academics, the first of these characteristics that we talk about is ontology, right? Or in more common words, it is a truth claim, that there is a truth that has either been experientially derived or intuitively arrived at, or through a study of material around us we've managed to glean, but we are asserting a truth claim. And every knowledge system in this world makes a truth claim. If you look at the Western knowledge tradition, for example, today, there are certain truth claims. Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am," because he was analyzing his own experience and what validates that. Right? In this tradition, we say, for example, one of the Mahavakyas that comes to us is Aham Brahmasmi. You're saying that I am. So I am, therefore I am. So in this sense, there is a truth claim that is distinct, and you cannot decouple that from the knowledge system. So there is a specific set of truth claims that the knowledge coming out of this geocultural space stakes and puts out for validation. And it becomes an ontological claim because it also actually has what we call the epistemology, the second characteristic. A truth claim can be a truth claim in isolation, but it won't be accepted as either universal or practical unless we are able to derive a method of arriving at that independently. This is what we mean by epistemologies. Right? How do we actually study a truth claim? How do we know what is really true? If there is a knowledge claim presented to us, how do we ensure that it is generalizable, it is validated, it is replicable? All of the scientific exploration that happens today when something has to be put out as a truth claim is also part of this knowledge system. And Indian knowledge system has its own epistemology. This comes to us as the idea of pramanas. How do we actually look at a specific truth claim, and what is the means for engaging in that dialectic of knowledge and understanding whether this fits into a schema or whether it has to be rejected. The six-fold pramana system of the Indian knowledge tradition gives us perhaps the richest epistemology. There is one significant difference that contrasts it with the rest of the knowledge traditions that we are able to see today, and which also seems to be the direction that we are heading in. There was tremendous emphasis in the Indian knowledge traditions, in the Indian knowledge system, on the first person subjective experience, what we call anubhuti. Because these traditions evolved not just out of the objective examination of reality outside, but there was also a tradition of looking inwards. In fact, all of the knowledge claim comes from the knowledge claim of the self. As the Upanishads say, what is that by knowing which I know everything else? And this has been the defining characteristic of the Indian mind. It seeks an integrality between elements. It does not look at elements disparately and try to go in a reductionist manner, trying to understand the isolated part. There is a tremendous rigor applied to the specifics, but it seeks to synthesize all of this, and that synthesis happens through a process of meditation, through a process of inquiry, through a process of self-awareness. And this is the distinctive hallmark, especially as we today talk about artificial intelligence, as we today talk about the conflicts that are arising in the world, unable to deal with diversity. The only true experience of oneness is through the subjective validation of our content. And this has been the Indian knowledge tradition. So there is a very specific epistemology that comes to us as pramana system. One of the most defining characteristics of that pramana system is the ability to validate the subjective experiences. And it is a truth claim that's validated by different people across the length and breadth of time, across this space, from north to south, east to west, based on this epistemology of sadhana, of being able to intuitively and through your own elevation of consciousness, be able to recognize and become one with the truth. This is a very distinctive hallmark of the Indian tradition. So you have a truth claim and you have certain ways of establishing the truth. The third element is axiology, pursuit of knowledge. And this is a major crisis. All across the world today, we are seeing universities are in strife. If you look at the Western world today, we are seeing that there is extraordinary struggle and chaos at the university level. In fact, some of the major universities this year had to suspend their activities because there seems to be a crisis of ethics. There seems to be a crisis of meaning. There seems to be a crisis of managing diversity. So it takes us back to the question of what are the values that inform the process of knowledge production. Is knowledge production or technology production more broadly, is that value agnostic? Is there no role for values in what is considered to be useful? Does knowledge become useful just because there is utility maximization, or is there a deeper aspect? So this question of axiology, which is basically the pursuit of values and the location of values in the pursuit of truth, becomes critical. And Indian knowledge tradition has its own axiology, which is very, very distinctive, which is very different to what we consider to be the standard today in the world. Indian knowledge tradition, particularly because it comes from this vision of oneness and the world as an integrated whole of one consciousness, is very careful about the methods deployed to extract truth. There's a huge emphasis culturally, civilizationally, and as part of knowledge production on non-violence. Because the life of not just the human life, the life of every species is considered to be sacred. It is considered to be inviolable. So this notion of sacrality, this question of whether it is anthropological, which has a higher, this view of humans as the apex does not really permeate the Indian knowledge tradition. We look at life as a set of interdependent activities, and there is an exchange at every second between all of us and the biosphere that we inhabit. So therefore, this question of values and what values does Indian knowledge system give us is a central one. In fact, it's going to be a critical one for the pursuit of knowledge across the world. Like we said, there is a challenge today about what truth seeking really stands for when students and teachers are not able to have a conversation in the spaces that they are supposed to. So there is a truth claim, there is a way to understand that truth, and there is a use and utility and a specificity to the values in the pursuit of that knowledge. These are the three conditions. But what makes knowledge a culture? What gives you the ability to live that knowledge? And particularly in the Indian tradition, in fact, our languages are perhaps the most important demonstrations of this. We do not have the notion of just knowing intellectually. That's why the idea of pursuit of knowledge in Indian tradition is called darshana. Darshana is becoming one with that knowledge. You have a sight of that knowledge. You become that knowledge. You embody that knowledge. It's not just an intellectual, analytical understanding, but it has to transform your behavior. That becomes knowledge. And culturally, we can see this value. So in technical terms, we can call this praxis. You can say aham brahmasmi. You can have any other truth claim. But how does somebody else validate that using the pramana system, but for themselves? So this is the system that comes to us. For example, yoga becomes the praxis for the Vedantic truth. When we talk about the Ashtanga Yoga method, when we look at the Yoga Sutras, which is the deepest exploration of human psychology, you would notice that there is a step-by-step graded process through which we are allowed to explore this knowledge and truth claim for ourselves. When Yoga Sutra says Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, it doesn't end there. It gives you an entire eightfold path to experiment it with yourself, to actually know the truth for yourself. It gives you the idea of yama niyamas. It gives you the meditative techniques. It gives you the sequence in which this has to be applied. That makes this knowledge personally relatable. And this is a critical thing to understand, because when we make a truth claim and to understand this civilization, when we say that Indian civilization is as a knowledge civilization, it's a civilization that was built by the empathy of our rishis who created these knowledge systems for all of us to deal with the fundamental questions of life. When the civilization gives us the idea of purushartha, when the idea of moksha and liberation is given to us, it is not just making a moral claim. It is actually giving you the methods to deploy on yourself and for yourself to experience that. This is why it is a living tradition. And today, we have the whole idea of heritage and heritage structures. You have multilateral organizations dedicated to that, but not too many civilizations, in fact, very few, if any, outside of the Indian civilization, can claim to be a living civilization with thought continuity and practice continuity. This is a moment of wonder, and maybe we haven't really explored this with enough wonder. There have been writers, A.L. Basham, he wrote all those years ago. He called it the wonder that was India. But that wonder was perhaps systematically hidden from us. So if we discover this wonder and if we ask, how is it that the same knowledge tradition, the same stotras, the same kind of traditions, the same kind of practices have had such tremendous continuity, then if we explore this with a little bit of humility, it is obvious to us that it must have given people value. Societies and civilizations discard what is of no use. They only retain, human societies retain what is valuable to them over a long period of time. It means that this knowledge was both valuable but also transmittable. It was transmittable and personally experienceable. So Indian knowledge system, when we talk about it as a civilizational building force, is the method of the production of knowledge, the distribution of that knowledge, the retention of this knowledge, and the living traditions of this knowledge. So if you look at this, we can ask ourselves that question that we began with. Cultures are organic, cultures emerge, cultures organize themselves around certain ideas, customs, rituals. They all give a certain meaning in life, but not all cultures become civilization. We claim that India is a civilization, a living, continuous civilization. It means that there must have been certain institutions that this civilization created for the perpetuation of what we consider to be of value. If you look at this, we can trace at least 3 institutions. There might be more. They can be political institutions, they can be social institutions. But purely from a knowledge system perspective, you can think about 3 fundamental institutions that make up our civilization. The first is family. The tremendous emphasis on family in the Indian tradition across all the entire region from north to south, regardless of which state you are in, which religion you are from, which region or which caste, all of the diverse factors notwithstanding, there is a tremendous emphasis in India about the centrality and primacy of family as an institution. And this is knowledge is also to us a form of our familial function. Knowledge was passed on to us in our family institutions. So when you think about the civilizational institution building, the central institution that holds all of it together, particularly in the Indian experience, and which is why for over 1,000 years, although we were colonized, we still have an authentic claim to be a living civilization, which is extraordinary because this central institution of family was never allowed to wither away. So that is the first institution that we see that our civilization has built and emphasized on. The second institution, and this is really perhaps unique to India, the idea of a guru. You can think about knowledge system or sampradaya or traditions, but the idea of a guru as somebody who is actually more important to us than, in some cases, all of our relatives. Right? We say that Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu. This tradition says that Guru is God. This reverence for somebody who gives us knowledge and the bond and the responsibility, the person who has knowledge to impart that into to other people. This is a lived tradition, and because there is this reciprocity of respect and trust, and the pedestal that a guru is given in this tradition, it has become an institution. There is a way in which gurus are both identified and respected by the society. They are nourished by the rest of the society. And the gurus in turn do the yajna, do the sacrifice, do the tapas to generate knowledge and leave it for their sishyas. And it is in the Guru Sishya tradition that we see the continuity of a lived knowledge system. So the second meta institution that this civilization created is the Guru Sampradaya or the Gurus. And Gurus are everywhere in Bharat. They are across Bharat, the entire traditions. You can see Gurus who are lived, embodied knowledge access or knowledge repositories for us. And the third and final great institution is a space where they brought all of these things together, where the social functions, the religious functions, the spiritual functions, the mystical functions, the economic functions, the cultural functions, the educational functions, the art and architecture, all of this. For example, if you look at the grand temples of India, the temples of India were really the repositories and the main generative force of our knowledge systems. It is in the temple that you had the art, architecture, economy, ecology, social, the practice of religion, the practice of mystical traditions, spiritual traditions, administrative functions. All of these things came together as one collective in the space of a temple. So these meta institutions that this civilization created and how they managed to transform one person's ability to seek knowledge into an institution that perpetuates is the wonder that is Indian knowledge system that powers the civilization. And why is this important for us to understand and link Indian knowledge systems with Indian civilizational building? Today, as we stand at the cusp of becoming the third largest economy in the world, we are talking about a potential great power status. We are talking about our place in the Committee of Nations. It is critical to understand, and our Honorable External Affairs Minister has written about this, that as India rises, there is going to be a contest. We are jostling for space in a very competitive, very strategic space. And those who are at the helm of world power today with entrenched systems would like to what he calls freeze the frame. They would like to make sure that the system that benefits the inhabitants today is retained as it is. We can think about India's place in Security Council. There is no way, no moral explanation for why a nation that represents so much of world size and population and people does not have a seat at the table in the Security Council. We think about some of the advancements that have happened, whether it is in artificial intelligence, in public health. All of these things are informed by knowledge systems. Some of our contemporaries have managed to influence the global architecture of institutions through their own knowledge systems. The traditional Chinese medicine is a very good example for that. So when we think about this geopolitical churn that's happening, where the existing order is perhaps withering away, the new order is not yet in place, and it by all means is going to be a multipolar world order, which power distributed across different segments, that is the one that is going to be giving a semblance of stability to the entire universal structure. It is only imperative that India, when it seeks the place at this table, brings with it its own knowledge system. And we, using our knowledge system, have to unfreeze that frame. And when India unfreezes that frame, the thing that is really exceptional about India historically and civilizationally, and Swami Vivekananda said it the best, India does not rise for herself. She rises for everyone. She is like that drop of snow which illuminates the entire world. So Indian knowledge system is the drop of snow which is here to illuminate the global futures. Thank you. And let's look at Indian knowledge systems as our lived tradition. Namaste.